And if there's anyone who wants your paper in particular to be read by myself, just send me an email, because the distribution is going to be more or less random, unless there's some people who have already specifically asked that I grade the paper, but otherwise, as I said, it's going to be pretty much random. Okay. So, and I will let you know, because she will be available to, once the papers have been returned to you, the papers will be returned to you in about 2 weeks' time. Possibly next Thursday, but I think that's unlikely. It'll probably be the week after, the Tuesday of the week after, okay? So at that point, I will let you know her contact information, and if you have any questions, you can bring them up with her. If your paper happens to have been graded by her, and there'll be an initial at the end of the grade, which will indicate to you who's graded the paper. Now, what I want to do today is I want to wrap up my discussion on politics in India. I've been talking to you about the Bangladesh War of Liberation. We hadn't actually started on that yet. I was sort of describing to you the backdrop there. So I want to complete my discussion of that, and remember that that is within the larger ambit of what I've been describing to you as a politics in India in the post-1947 period. And that itself is something that I had basically partitioned into 3 parts. One is, domestic politics. And then the politics of India with respect to neighboring states such as Pakistan and Sri Lanka, and then finally the third part, which is geopolitics, India's relations, for example, with the United States, with the Soviet Union, and its role in something which I think is exceedingly important, and I'm going to certainly talk about that a fair bit, and that is decolonization, which is one of the principal features of the second half of the 20th century. Okay, so let me go back to the question of the Bangladesh War of Liberation. Remember this map that I'd shown to you before, West Pakistan over there, East Pakistan, divided by 1,000 miles of Indian territory, so that's about 1,600 kilometers. And now I think we need to understand a little bit of the context of what was really transpiring in Pakistan. So at the time of partition in 1947, West Pakistan would have had fewer people than East Pakistan. Okay, fewer people. But if you go back to, you remember the slide that I'd shown you? I want to just turn your attention to that once again, just so that this slide over here. So this is West Pakistan, and now of course just Pakistan. And I had mentioned to you that West Pakistan was dominated really by the Punjabi elite. Most of the military positions would have been filled by the Punjabi elite. There's a new capital territory called Islamabad. The other major city down in Sindh, which is not shown on this map, is Karachi, which is a port city. And then you've got the Pathans there. I want to mention a little bit about the Pathans before I move back to the question of what happened in 1971 that led to the further split of Pakistan and the creation of Bangladesh. So this area that you see on the top there, called Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, so this used to be known as a Northwest Frontier Province, and the principal population there is the population of Pathans, also known as the Pashtos. So, much of the discussion that you've seen in the newspapers over the course of the last 10 to 15 years in the wake of 9/11, when there are reference to Afghanistan, most of this has to do with the Pathans over there. Now, one of the very interesting things is that there is this kind of a mythography about the Pathans. The mythography is that the Pathans are an extremely violent lot. This is the mythography. Okay, extremely violent lot. That there are constant disputes over women and land, and this is basically what tribal life in that part of the world is like. Now, one of the very interesting things is that in the 1920s, 1930s, the most disciplined core of nonviolent resistance to British rule came from the Pathans. Something that is not that well understood, because of course on the one hand you have this sort of stereotype that the Pathans are completely addicted to violence, that the Pathan the rifle is like water to others. It's just something that they live on. All right. But on the other hand, what we're saying, and Gandhi himself, the chief architect of Indian nonviolence, admitted that he had never seen a more disciplined army of nonviolent resistors than the Pathans, who were going to be led by a man called Badshah Khan, also known as Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan. You'll find his name, in numerous texts. Okay, so some of the anomalies about the Pathans would have to be understood as well. But one of the things that is interesting about the Pathans that is pertinent for our discussion is that when the partition took place in 1947, the Pathans themselves, by the way, you find some Pathans in Afghanistan and some in Pakistan. Okay, and that itself is an accident which goes back to colonial times. How that happened is something that we can't really talk about at the moment. But the interesting thing is that the Pathans were left in a bit of a quandary because the Pathans never supported, even though they're all Muslims. Okay, the Pathans are all Muslims, they never supported the idea of partition. And so when the partition of India took place and Pakistan was created as a new nation state, the Pathans were extremely uncomfortable being in a state that was now a predominantly Muslim state, that even though ostensibly it was defined as a secular state, it was in fact actually a theocratic state, in de facto, in actual practice, right? So this question of the Pathans is enormously interesting because it is a precursor for us to understand what happened in 1971. Because remember, what is the whole theory of the partition based upon? In a phrase, it's based upon the two-nation theory, that the Hindus constitute one distinct nation and the Muslims constitute a second distinct nation, and that there is really nothing that enables the Hindus and Muslims to live in common. Right? Now, if that's the case, then you would assume that all the Muslims who had been bundled together into a place called Pakistan simply on the grounds that they all happen to be Muslims, then one would have thought that, well, Pakistan is going to be secure because now it's all Muslims. And of course, what I'm giving you here, the illustration of the Pathans, is that, well, that was not really the case because there was a significant chunk of the population here, that is this group known as the Pathans, who in fact never really agreed with the idea of the partition at all. Now, we're going to see that in 1971, the fruits of this way of thinking are going to become clear. Okay, that is that things are going to start to unravel. Why are they going to start to unravel? If you go to West Pakistan, now you find that numerically it has fewer Muslims than East Pakistan. However, the elite, the ruling elite, the military elite, all came from West Pakistan, and in particular it came from the Punjabi element within West Pakistan. And in a nutshell, what the Bengalis found in East Pakistan, because they were not Punjabis. So you have to remember that now we're speaking about groups that are linguistically completely different. Okay? And they're not only linguistically completely different, they're culturally very different. And why are they culturally very different? Because the supposition among the Muslims in Pakistan, in West Pakistan, that is the Punjabi Muslims, was that they represented a more authentic version of Islam, a more masculine, a more muscular version of Islam. The Bengalis in East Pakistan were always viewed by the Punjabis as being effeminate. And you know what the word effeminate means? Effeminate means men who display excessive qualities of the female. Right? Women cannot, of course, be effeminate. Men are effeminate. Women cannot be effeminate, because if a man is effeminate, it means that a man is displaying qualities that are more characteristic of a woman. Right? And so the supposition among the Punjabis was that the Bengalis are really an effeminate lot. And one of the reasons they're an effeminate lot is because they have lived in close proximity with Hindus and have allowed themselves to be contaminated by this faith, which is a softer, less muscular kind of religion. Okay? So I'm suggesting to you that there were a number of things that are going to happen which are going to make the whole state of Pakistan unravel in 1971. The typical political story that is given, and I'll tell you what the political story is, but I'm giving you the cultural story now. The political story is that the West Pakistan population was smaller in number than the population of East Pakistan. Notwithstanding that, they in fact actually exercised power. And how does it become clear? It becomes clear because in December 1970, you have an election. Okay? And when we have an election in Pakistan, we're talking about an election taking part in both parts of Pakistan. Because remember, it's one country. Taking part in West Pakistan and in East Pakistan. In East Pakistan, let me just turn your attention to a different slide over here, which will make clear to you what's happening over here. Okay? So in 1966, you have the rise of a Bengali political leader in East Pakistan. His name is Mujibur Rahman. He's the leader of a party called the Awami League. Okay, so in December 1970, you have these elections. East Pakistan has 162 seats out of the 300 seats. So that's more than 50%. Okay, more than 50% of the seats are allotted to East Pakistan. Why does East Pakistan have more seats than West Pakistan in the Legislative Assembly? For the simple reason that East Pakistan has a greater share of the population, because the number of seats you get is proportional, of course, to the population that you have. Now the Awami League wins 160 out of the 162 seats. So in other words, the leader of the Awami League is now legally entitled to be the leader of all of Pakistan. Of all of Pakistan, West Pakistan and East Pakistan. Okay, because his party has 160 out of the 300 seats in the entire Legislative Assembly of Pakistan. This is a majority. However, the Punjabi elite was not going to permit the Awami League to in fact constitute the government. And it was not going to allow the Awami League under Mujibur Rahman to constitute the government for reasons that I partly described to you. Partly the reasons are cultural. That is, that the Bengalis were seen as representing a softer kind of Islam, an inauthentic version of Islam. They were seen as being more effeminate, right? That they were not the kind of people who could actually lead a nation state, right? Those are the cultural reasons. And of course, some of the economic reasons had to do with the fact that if the Awami League now forms the government, what's going to happen is that a greater proportion of the revenues of the state are going to go to East Pakistan. Because what had happened from 1947 until 1970, and I think it's unquestionably true, that East Pakistan received a disproportionately very small amount of the total revenues from Pakistan. Okay? Even though it constituted the majority of the population. So these are some of the things that are now going to lead to the unraveling of the state of Pakistan. And what's going to happen is that in March 1971, so remember the elections have taken place in December 1970, if the election results are followed and if the election results are honored, then obviously the Awami League under the leadership of Mujibur Rahman should now be occupying the seat of power. They should be at the helm of the state, but this doesn't happen. Okay, and in March 1971, the Pakistani army is going to launch what is called Operation Searchlight. And what is this? It's basically a military operation to instill oppression, to instill military rule in East Pakistan. And you know, the numbers here, by the way, are disputed down to the present day, but I think that there is now a pretty wide consensus that what took place in East Pakistan in 1971 should be described as a genocide. Okay? Now, this is not, by the way, taught in Pakistan at all. I mean, if you've grown up in Pakistan and you've gone to school in Pakistan, and you look at Pakistani history textbooks, you know, what transpires in East Pakistan in 1971 is something that is not mentioned at all, basically, right? And when we say genocide, what are we talking about? Well, the numbers are hotly disputed, and anywhere between 300,000 to 3 million. I think 3 million is way too high a figure. I don't think there's an iota of evidence to suggest that the scale of the genocide was something of that kind. But even if you go with the lower figure, you're talking about a very substantial number of people who are going to be killed. And Operation Searchlight also included, for example, such things as the deliberate targeting of intellectuals. So one of the things that the West Pakistani Army did in 1971 was they shelled Dhaka University. And a large proportion of the faculty of Dhaka University is going to be killed. in late March 1971. All right. Now, one of the consequences of this, of course, is that you're going to have a huge number of people who are going to start fleeing East Pakistan. So if you want to think of a comparable situation, what would you think about Syria? That would be the comparable situation today. Okay? So what you've got a large number of people who are going to start Bengalis, that is East Pakistani Bengalis, mainly Muslims, not entirely, more than 90% Muslim. There would be some Christians, some Hindus, because East Pakistan had a larger proportion of minorities than did West Pakistan. And in East Pakistan, the minorities were not going to be hounded as much as they're going to be hounded in West Pakistan. So this proportion is going to remain relatively higher of minorities. But nonetheless, it's, again, of course, obviously a Muslim predominant nation. Okay? So you're going to have 6 million refugees who are going to flood into India. And again, the situation is, somewhat comparable with what's happening in Syria today, because except that it's much more acute here. And why is it comparable, and what are the differences with let's say modern day Syria today? Because the countries into which the refugees have been flooding from Syria are countries that themselves are not exactly the most affluent countries in the world. Right? So if you've got refugees going from Syria into Jordan or into Lebanon, well, these are not countries that are doing spectacularly well themselves. So it obviously imposes a substantial burden on the state. Now imagine if 6 million refugees start to flood into a country such as India, where you already have a substantial population that is already malnourished, right? Where there's obviously an inequitable distribution of food, of resources, of access to toilets, access to water, right? And cost of feeding them was estimated to be very conservative, and we're talking about giving them, a bare bone diet, essentially. Cost of feeding them is estimated at that point to be approximately $3 to $4 million a day, right? And I remember when I was growing up in Delhi in 1971, that one of the things that the Indian government did was they produced a special stamp, a 5 paisa stamp. It's 100 paisa make up a rupee. A 5 paisa stamp, which was a surcharge. So every time you sent a letter, you had to add that 5 paisa stamp, because it was a way to subsidize for people who were using the postal service. They were effectively trying to subsidize some of the state expenses that were being moved towards the refugees. Okay, so 6 million refugees flood into India, and eventually it's going to lead to a war with India. One of the reasons it's going to lead to a war with India, of course, is because there is enormous pressure upon India. India is trying to exert its influence to try to mitigate the situation in East Pakistan. You have a guerrilla movement in East Pakistan, a guerrilla force called the Mukti Bahini, and there is no question that the Mukti Bahini is being aided by the Indian state, that they are certainly lending their support. In Pakistan, of course, the view was that India would desire nothing more than to see the breakup of Pakistan. Okay, that was obviously the view that predominated in Pakistan itself. War is eventually going to break out. If you go to the last portion of the slide over there, war is eventually going to break out in early December, and it's going to lead to the surrender, the unconditional surrender of Pakistani forces in less than 2 weeks' time. I just want to show you a few slides here. This is a very famous photograph from the photographer Raghu Rai. So what you see here is a Bengali man here, and you've got a soldier there, and he's peeking down his dhoti, because of course he's seeing whether this man has hidden some arms in his clothes. This is one of the photographs. There were hundreds of them that were circulated in those days. Much of this was not, as I said, known that widely in 1971 itself, but then subsequently over the years people became more aware of the scale of the genocide. So here you have a couple of rickshawalas who've been slaughtered, and this is a photograph. If you see the woman there, basically just bones. These are many of the people who were suffering from starvation as a consequence of harsh living conditions. This is what is called, this is the first page of what is called the blood telegram. It's called the blood telegram because there's an American diplomat who is stationed in Dhaka, and he warns the Americans, he warns his superiors in Washington that what you have going on in East Pakistan is a genocide. Okay, and this telegram is written, of course, long before the war broke out. Okay, so the date over there, October 01, there that you see, and this is what he says. Aware of the task force proposals on openness in the Foreign Service and with the conviction that U.S. policy related to recent developments in East Pakistan serves neither our moral interests, broadly defined, nor our national interests, narrowly defined, numerous officers of the American Consulate General Dhaka, that's the abbreviation, AMCONGEN, USA Dhaka, and USIS, that's the United States Information Services Dhaka, consider it their duty to register strong dissent with fundamental aspects of this policy. So they're telling their superiors in Washington that we disagree with American foreign policy, and I'll tell you what the American foreign policy was in a moment. Our government has failed to denounce the suppression of democracy. Our government has failed to denounce atrocities. Our government has failed to take forceful measures to protect its citizens, etc., etc. Okay? So this is what's called the Blood Telegram. There's a book, by the way, that's been written called The Blood Telegram, and the author of that book was on campus just a few months ago. It's a very detailed study of what exactly happened in 1971 and what was the role of the United States. Because the US, unfortunately, but quite typically, came down on the wrong side of the question, if I may put it this way. That is that the US supported Pakistan. So what they ended up supporting really was a genocide here, and one of the consequences of the US support for Pakistan was that India was now going to turn to the Soviet Union, because you have to remember what the larger backdrop is. What is the larger backdrop? You've got a Cold War going on, right? Okay, and this is where we're eventually going to get to the question of non-alignment and what was India's foreign policy from the 1940s, late 1940s through the 50s, 60s, 70s. But effectively what I'm saying is that you've got the US, which is supporting Pakistan, India, which is now under the leadership of Indira Gandhi, the daughter of Jawaharlal Nehru. She is going to fly to Moscow and she's going to sign an Indo-Soviet Friendship Treaty. And essentially what this treaty did was it stipulated that if in the event that either the Soviet Union or India should be attacked by a hostile nation, that each country would be obligated to assist the other. Okay, so what Indira Gandhi did, of course, was she brought herself some insurance, because the idea was that if the Americans are going to support Pakistan, well, where is India going to be left now? Okay, what insurance does India fundamentally have in a situation of this kind, right? So this is in brief. Obviously there we can add thousands of details to this, but in brief, this is the story of what transpires in 1971. And when the war is going to be concluded, so this here is a map that just shows you troop movements. This is a very famous photograph, which is, and the caption there tells you, Lieutenant General Niazi signing the instrument of surrender. So this is the Pakistani general who's signing the surrender, and that's the Indian general there, a Sikh. Which is, again, important, because one of the things that India was trying to project, of course, was itself as a country that was a liberal democracy, pluralistic, so forth and so on. In fact, the person who was the commander general of the forces of India was a Parsi, okay, that is a Zoroastrian. The major general involved here is a Sikh. Because, of course, one of the things that India was very keen on doing was making sure that people did not understand this simply as a Hindu-Muslim kind of conflict, that this is a conflict between two nation states. Okay? So here, signing the instrument of surrender at Dhaka, 16th December 1971. And when this instrument of surrender is signed, what comes into being is a new nation state. So East Pakistan is now going to be known as Bangladesh. Yes?
What was the date when West Pakistan invaded East?
The Operation Searchlight, March 1971. Late March 1971. Okay? Yeah. So basically 10 months after that is when you have the war breaking out between India and Pakistan in December of that year. All right? Yes?
To clarify, when you say that the war broke out between India and Pakistan,
yeah.
that's between India and the forces of East Pakistan?
No, West Pakistan.
Oh, West Pakistan.
West Pakistan, yeah, because India was assisting. So remember, the East Pakistani army it's just a division of the army of Pakistan. There's only one nation state at that point. It's just got two wings. One is West Pakistan, the other is East Pakistan. But the military elite came almost exclusively from West Pakistan. So when I say war broke out, I'm talking about war breaking out between India and Pakistan. Okay, and when we say West Pakistan, that's simply an internal division, right? There's only one nation state at that point, right? And so the war is going to be fought largely on the west. It's going to be fought somewhat on the eastern frontier, but it's also going to be fought on the western frontier, simply because when the war breaks out, it can break out on a number of different frontiers, you know. Yeah. Okay. So 1971 is going to be the birth of Bangladesh, and the subsequent history of relations between India and Bangladesh is of interest, but we'll have to leave it out for a second over here. This photograph here, so this is Mujibur Rahman, the man who had led the Awami League, and this is a photograph dated from 1974. On the left you see Bhutto, okay, who's going to be the Prime Minister of Pakistan. Subsequently, his daughter is going to become the Prime Minister as well, Benazir, right? And she's going to be assassinated, as we know, a few years ago. But again, that's another story that we need not be concerned with at the moment. Now what I want to do is I want to just essentially wrap up my discussion of this section on politics. Want to alert you to a few other considerations before I move to the last segment of my discussion of politics, and that has to do with India's relations with the Soviet Union, the US, and its attempts to project itself as a regional power, both in the 50s and 60s, but particularly in the last 20 years when neoliberalization reforms have taken place, and therefore India feels that it is now a rather more substantial player in the world economy than it used to be. Right, so we talked about the dispute over Kashmir, war with Pakistan, Indochina War. Let me say a few things about that. So in 1962, there's going to be a short war. It takes India completely by surprise, because what you have is you have Chinese divisions which move down into northeast India, into places such as Arunachal Pradesh. And I think there is no question that there is an enormous disequilibrium of power between the Chinese and the Indians. And the Indians are in no position to resist at all. Okay, but it's more, but this war, as it's called, is more, if I may put it this way, a series of lightning strikes by the Chinese where they're able to take control of some of the territory that has been disputed over a period of time between India and China, because remember that India shares some borders with China, and then they're going to subsequently withdraw their forces. So this is effectively what we speak about when we say the Indochina War of 1962. Now, India's position on Tibet is an interesting one, because for those of you who are somewhat cognizant of what's been happening in Tibet, you know that the Dalai Lama is going to flee Tibet in 1959, and he's going to find hospitality in India. In fact, the Tibetans have had a government in exile based in India for the last 6 decades. Right? And that is obviously a point of tension between India and China, because as some of you are certainly aware, the Chinese are completely inhospitable to any argument which can be put forward on behalf of Tibetan independence. And so one of the bones of contention between China and India for the last 6 decades has obviously been the fact that India decided that it was going to offer hospitality to the Dalai Lama, who's going to flee to India in 1959. One of the things that India has attempted to do over the course of the last several decades is to try to negotiate some kind of truce with China on the question of Tibet. So basically the Indian position is that, well, our traditions of hospitality do not permit us to turn the Dalai Lama and the Tibetans away. And when I say the Dalai Lama having taken exile in India, I'm not speaking only about him and the leadership of the Tibetan community. I'm talking about large Tibetan communities that have developed in certain portions of India. In Delhi itself, for example, you have a very substantial Tibetan population. Okay? And of course, the Chinese see all of these diasporic Tibetan populations as possible points of resistance to Chinese hegemony over Tibet. Okay? And here I'm not for obvious reasons, getting into the question of whether I think that the Tibetan claims to autonomy are right or not, what is my particular position on this. I think that most of you can infer my position on this probably, but I'm not getting into that question. I'm simply here looking very briefly at what India's position is on Tibet. And the gist of it is that to the present day, the position fundamentally is that look, our traditions of hospitality, our neutrality in this conflict do not permit us to turn the Tibetans away. They've come here, they've sought hospitality, they've sought refuge, we're going to give it to them. But on the other hand, we don't want to interfere in the internal affairs of China, okay, and the PRC. So unlike many other countries, for example, that there are countries such as Australia, okay, which in recent years have not permitted the Dalai Lama to speak in Australia because of pressure applied by the PRC, by the People's Republic of China. Now, of course, in India, the situation is different because the Dalai Lama lives in India. He lives in India and he's constantly giving speeches and lectures in India, right? But nonetheless, the Indian position is that, well, this is simply a condition of the fact that we are the country that the Dalai Lama decided to come to, but nonetheless we maintain a certain kind of neutrality with respect to the Chinese policy on Tibet. Okay, so that's roughly what you need to understand about that. We've talked about the creation of Bangladesh, civil war in Sri Lanka, okay, and the Indian Peacekeeping Force. Now this is a monumental subject, and again I'm going to have to encapsulate everything in just a few minutes. Okay, because, and this is where the history of India, because we are doing South Asia here now, we're not just talking about India, this is where the history of India is going to intersect with the history of neighboring countries. We've talked about Pakistan and Bangladesh, but I think briefly we need to look at what's happening in Sri Lanka too. So Sri Lanka, I'm sure that all of you remember, is basically a teardrop over here. This is Sri Lanka, okay? And known in colonial times as Ceylon. And the population of Sri Lanka can be divided as follows. So you have a group of people who speak Sinhalese. That's the dominant language, and they're the Sinhala. Okay, and the religion happens to be largely Buddhist. I mean, there are some Sinhalese who might be Christian, but predominantly Buddhist. Now you have a large Tamil-speaking population. Remember that this is the state of Tamil Nadu in India. Okay, and there have been strong links between the state of Tamil Nadu and Sri Lanka, or Ceylon as it used to be known in colonial times. There are numerous ways to describe this link. I just want to give you one illustration of this link, and that's all. And this is not to say that it describes all the links between the people of Tamil Nadu, okay, and South India as a whole, and Sri Lanka. And that one link is that in the 19th century, a large number of Indians went to many parts of the world, such as Guyana, Suriname, Fiji, Trinidad, South Africa, Malaysia, okay? And some of these countries, by the way, have a predominantly Indian population. So if you go to Trinidad, 45% of the population of Trinidad is Indian. If you go to Fiji, over 50% of the population used to be Indian. Now the circumstances under which this happened were that India was a colony, and all of these places were colonies in the 19th century. And so when you had the abolition of slavery in 1835, so the abolition of slavery in 1835, what are most of these places? What do they have? For example, Trinidad, or Guyana, or Suriname, or Jamaica, sugar plantations, right? So you need a labor force to work on the sugar plantations. It used to be the slaves. When you have the abolition of slavery, the slaves are going to hike up their price for their labor, obviously. So what the plantation owners wanted to do, I'm giving it to you in a nutshell, of course. What the plantation owners wanted to do was they wanted to find a cheap source of labor. They got their labor from India. Okay, now those are the circumstances under which one strand of migration from Tamil Nadu, okay, and neighboring parts of India, one strand of migration from South India to Sri Lanka takes place in the 19th century. Except that we're not talking about sugar plantations here, we're talking about tea plantations. Sri Lanka was going to be a major tea growing country. So what you have, in other words, is you have a historical link between Sri Lanka and India. And now you have to turn back to the situation in Sri Lanka. Okay? And some of the reasons for that conflict are not dissimilar from the reasons for the conflict between Pakistan, between West Pakistan and East Pakistan. One of the things I did not mention to you deliberately at that time, I wanted to mention it in this context here, is that one of the reasons for the dispute between West Pakistan and East Pakistan is that in early 1948, that is shortly after independence and the creation of Pakistan, the leader of Pakistan, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, declared Urdu to be the official language of all of Pakistan. All of Pakistan, including East Pakistan, which is only Bengali speaking. Okay? And when, you know what happens when you declare, what percentage of the population of Pakistan actually spoke Urdu in early 1948? Does anybody know? 4%. So imagine, a language that is spoken by only 4% of the population of a country now becomes notified as the national language of that country. And of course, one of the consequences of declaring a language to be the national language is that the state's resources are going to be allocated largely for that language. And it's going to become mandatory to teach that language to people who have no relationship with that language at all. Now something similar is going to happen in Sri Lanka. Why something similar? Because you've got the Sinhala or the Sinhalese, okay, who happen to be Buddhist, largely Buddhist. Then you have a South Indian Tamil speaking population in Sri Lanka, a minority, but a significant minority. And they happen to be largely Hindus, but some of them are also Muslims, because they were South Indian Muslims as well. Okay? And so one of the reasons this conflict is going to be engendered in Sri Lanka is that the Sri Lankan government, which is Buddhist and Sinhalese dominated, is going to declare Sinhalese or Sinhala to be the official language of all of Sri Lanka. Okay? Now that's going to create a problem, right? Because obviously there are people who are going to feel aggrieved. There are going to be people who are going to feel extremely aggrieved at such a situation. And as I said, the story is obviously an extremely complicated one, because we would then have to look at question of economic resources. What percentage of the economic resources are being allocated to the minority community? Does the minority community feel that it has certain kinds of reassurances from the state, from the majority community? Remember Gandhi's litmus test of a democracy. One of the litmus tests of a democracy is, how does it treat its minorities? Right? So in Sri Lanka, to cut to the chase, it's very clear that you're going to have the Tamil community feeling that it is not being given the kinds of resources that it deserves, that it's being discriminated against. And what you're going to get in Sri Lanka eventually is you're going to get a full-blown civil war. Okay? And we're talking about a civil war that is really quite extraordinary, because one of the things that I think only people who have studied this conflict and have studied the techniques of the major guerrilla organization, you know, officially this civil war ended 5 years ago. Okay, so you have a movement. It's called the LTTE. That's the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam. Okay, Tamil Eelam means Tamil homeland. So what are they doing? What is this movement standing for? Liberation Tigers, okay, of Tamil Eelam. This is the name of the guerrilla group of the Tamils, who basically say that, well, what we want is we want a Tamil homeland in Sri Lanka. The LTTE pioneered virtually all the major advances in guerrilla warfare in the last 4 decades in the world. Okay? And not all of them to their credit. So for example, the use of suicide bombers. I mean, now everybody's heard of suicide bombers. Well, who first really started that wave of suicide bombing? It's the LTTE. Okay? You know, you send a bomber there to a crowded marketplace and, you know, you blow yourself up. the use of children as part of an armed force. Okay, the use of the internet. You know, for example, the US government monitors very carefully, as you can imagine. I mean, they're completely understandable why they would do that, but the US government monitors extremely carefully what happens on the internet. You know, what is the kind of chatter that the jihadi groups are engaging in, but more importantly, what kind of transfers of money take place through the internet. Well, who first started using the internet, okay, for transfers of money to terrorist groups or guerrilla groups? The LTTE. Okay, so basically the LTTE is a guerrilla group which engages in armed revolutionary violence against the state. And what you're going to have, as I said, is you're going to have a civil war that's going to be really brutal on both sides, absolutely brutal on both sides, and it's going to be brought to something of what you might be called a conclusion, a very tentative conclusion in my view, but nonetheless something of a conclusion about 5 years ago. Okay, after having been waged for 3 decades. Now, India, of course, is partially involved in what happens in Sri Lanka, and this is where this is where we come up with the Indian Peacekeeping Force, because of course you had the minority in Sri Lanka was a Tamil-speaking minority, and where are some of these guerrillas being trained? Some of them are being trained in South India, in training camps. There's no question about it. On the other hand, India also wants to be a regional power. It wants to project itself as maybe a state that can, you know, help to resolve the conflict, right? So one of the things that's going to happen is that it's going to send what is called an Indian Peacekeeping Force. Again, without getting into any of the details about that, the conclusion of most policy experts and scholars who have studied this is that the Indian Peacekeeping Force was not very successful. In fact, what really happened was that it further inflamed tensions over there. Okay, and eventually the Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, who is the grandson of Jawaharlal Nehru, he's going to be assassinated by a female suicide bomber, okay, in India in 1990. A Tamilian Sri Lankan suicide bomber. So this is what I mean when I speak about the geopolitics of what's happening in South Asia itself, India's relations with, okay, all of these states. Borders of India, well, obviously this is partly addressed under the rubric of wars with Pakistan and China, right, so I'm not really going to entertain this question any further. And then finally, if we turn to the last two points here, attempts by India to try to forge some kind of regional cooperation between the states. So one of the things you have is you have what is called SAARC, which is the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, and it includes all the states of South Asia. They have annual meetings. But this is what I would call pro forma. This is what states have to do to show that, well, we're making some attempts to forge alliances and networks with other states in the area. And India's attempts to assert itself as a regional power, partially reflected, of course, in the fact that it sent an Indian Peacekeeping Force, but there would be other illustrations of that as well. Now with this, let me turn to the last segment of this discussion of India's politics and politics in South Asia post 1947, and that is India on the world stage. Okay, I think that if at all one had to point to something which one could say was a credit to India and where India tried to exercise some influence, it would have to be India's role in promoting decolonization throughout the world. Because I want to reiterate something that I have mentioned in this class on 2 or 3 previous occasions, and that is that in the second half of the 20th century, in the second half, the primary political development that affects most of the people in the world is what you would call decolonization. Okay, and when I say decolonization, what I'm talking about is a substantial number of countries where liberation and anti-colonial movements are eventually going to lead to independence. Okay, then alongside India, in the beginning years in the post-World War II period, the classic case, of course, other than India, is the case of Indonesia, which was under Dutch rule, and then in the aftermath of World War II, Indonesia is going to acquire independence from the Dutch. Right? So, and when I say decolonization, I'm obviously talking about, for example, what happened in Vietnam. Right? A much more convoluted story, of course, because here you don't have complete decolonization until substantially later. Right? And obviously after a war that is really quite catastrophic for the people of Vietnam. But decolonization in Algeria, which again happens after a long, bitter civil war. Okay? Right? But so in some cases it's going to be accompanied by civil wars, it's going to be accompanied by inner turmoil, but we're not looking at the history of all of these countries. What we're saying is that India was trying to lend its moral support to most of these decolonization movements. One of the classic instances of that would be the support given by India to the anti-apartheid struggle. Okay, because South Africa becomes an official apartheid state in 1949. Of course, they always had racial separation long before 1949, but the official policy of apartheid gets launched in 1949, and India was a very strong supporter of Mandela and the ANC. The ANC is the African National Congress. Okay, a very strong supporter of Kenyatta in Kenya, for example. Okay. So forth and so on. So what you have is, and particularly with respect to Africa, there were extremely strong attempts made to forge alliances between Indians and Africans, right? So, various delegations, various kinds of cultural meetings, so forth and so on. And in this context, I also want to mention very briefly India's position on Israel and Palestine. So India was in a very interesting was in a bit of a quandary. I mean, an interesting set of problems for India here. Why was it in a bit of a quandary? India had, of course, a substantial population of Muslims. Now, you can imagine that if there's going to be a substantial population of Muslims, that there's going to be substantial pressure from Muslim communities in India that India should obviously support Palestine and should support the Arabs, right? And that stands to reason. On the other hand, it has to be said, and I'm going to urge all of you who are interested in questions of how different communities interact with each other in a liberal democracy, for example, or how they interact with each other in the pre-modern period. I'm going to turn your attention to the question of Jews in India. What's the history of Jews in India? And one of the things we know from the history of Jews in India is that it is the one country in the world where there was no instance of anti-Semitism. No history of anti-Semitism at all. So, for example, you look at a reasonably recent book published by the University of California Press by Nathan Katz, K-A-T-Z. The book is called Who Are the Jews of India? Okay, and he basically gives you a history of that. So the essence of the matter is what now? The essence of the matter is that India had long-standing relations with the Jewish community. Minuscule, by the way, in size, but it's not the numbers that matter. What matters here is the fact that the Jews had a very different kind of experience in India than they'd had, for example, in Europe, where they had been subjected to discrimination and pogroms over centuries. Now, this was not the case in India. So there was some sympathy in India towards the creation of the State of Israel. I think there's no question about that at all. And there was some sympathy because many people understood what the fate of the Jew had been in Europe. And of course, and by the way, during World War II, when you obviously had the Holocaust, but you also had outward Jewish migration to the extent that countries were willing to take Jews fleeing Europe, there were numerous attempts to bring Jews into India as well. So you have some Jews who are going to come to India as well, who are going to basically put down their roots over there, and many of them were unaware of the fact that they were Jewish people who had been living in India for 2,000 years when these people came to India. Okay, so you have some attempts of this kind happening in World War II, but the fundamental quandary for India is that on the one hand, it understands fully well that you have aspirations for freedom among the Arabs and that Palestine has gone through the same fate that India has gone, because what was Palestine? It was a mandate, and the British eventually decided to partition Palestine, right? I mean, and that's partly the roots of the problem that you have down to the present day. So there's considerable sympathy for the Arabs, there's sympathy for the Palestinians, and by and large, India takes the view that it supports the establishment of a Palestinian state. On the other hand, there is considerable sympathy for the Jews as well. Okay? So this is the quandary, but eventually India takes a position, and the position that India took was a position that most what were called third world nations took, which was that it refused to give recognition to the State of Israel. So when the State of Israel was created in 1948, India did not recognize the State of Israel. Right? And if you had an Indian passport, in fact, I recall distinctly that the Indian passport at one point, they would, when they gave the passport to you, they would put a stamp on it, and the stamp would say, this passport is not valid for travel to Israel or South Africa. Okay? The two states with which India did not have diplomatic relations in the late 1940s, moving into the 50s, 60s, and thereafter. The situation was going to completely alter, a couple of decades ago. But that was a position on Israel and Palestine in the aftermath of independence. Yes?
What was the reaction of Jews to their, when they found out India?
Well, many of the Jews in India did what Jews everywhere else did. Migrate to Israel. Migrate to Israel. So India, in fact, actually lost most of its Jewish community. And you still have about 3,000 Jews, but that's almost nothing, right? I mean, out of 1.2 billion, it's almost nothing. The Cochin, which has the oldest synagogue in Asia. So Cochin is a city in the state of Kerala. Okay, it's over here, city of Cochin. And there's a whole portion of Cochin which is called Jewtown. So there's a synagogue there which goes back several hundred years ago. There are only 6 Jews left in Cochin today. And you know that in order to have a service in a synagogue, you need 10 Jews. So the only time they can have their service is when they have Jewish tourists, and then what they do is they try to detain the Jewish tourists and say, would you please just stay for a few more hours so that we can have a proper service? We haven't had a service in the synagogue for 6 months or whatever. Right? But that's the answer to your question in that sense is very simple. And most of the Jews, by the way, who stayed behind, they fully understood what the complications were for India, because India had a very substantial Muslim population. So clearly there was enormous pressure on the Indian state that it should take a position that would be pro-Arab and pro-Palestine. Right? Okay, and again, we're not evaluating the merits of the argument for Palestine or not. We're just describing what India's position was with respect to these questions. Yes?
If India wasn't letting people use their passports to get to Israel, it's not how the Jews get to Israel.
Oh no, but those you can always give an exemption. States issue exemptions. You can issue a document which overwrites the normal. Yeah, that's not an issue. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so now India's position with respect to the major question that was on the front burner for most states, and that major issue was, are you part of the Soviet bloc, either explicitly or implicitly, right? Or are you part of the NATO alliance, part of the American bloc, so to speak, right? And India's position was a position of what is called non-alignment. So this is a policy that was pioneered by Jawaharlal Nehru, the first prime minister, and part of the reason that Nehru and the Indian leadership was extremely keen on this policy was that they took the view that there were problems with both ideologies. Because of course the American bloc was a bloc that stood for free market economics. And part of the American bloc was obviously Great Britain, which was an imperialist power. Of course, it is going to cease to become an imperialist power because it's going to be gradually stripped of all of its colonies. The other country that was a major part of the American bloc was obviously France, another imperialist power. And the United States itself was frankly an imperialist power. So, of course, the Indian view was that, well, we can't really align ourselves with the forces of imperialism. even though these are the same forces that claim to be speaking for liberal democracy around the rest of the world. On the other hand, the problem is that you obviously cannot ally yourself with the Soviet Union because it was very clear that there had been enormous atrocities that had been committed by the communists, right? So I'm giving it to you again in a nutshell. So the Indian view was adopt a policy of what is called non-alignment, chart out a distinct path if you can, a third distinct path, right? And one of the highlights of this distinct path is a conference that's going to take place in Bandung. Bandung is in Indonesia. It's called the Bandung Conference in 1955, where Jawaharlal Nehru of India, Nasser of Egypt, Tito of Yugoslavia, and Sukarno of Indonesia. So these are the four leaders of the four major countries that are part of the non-aligned bloc. They draft a statement, they release a statement suggesting that the Cold War has been extremely debilitating for nations around the world, that the energies and resources of the world have been diverted towards causes that are frivolous, and that substantial issues which have to do with equality, with social opportunity, with justice have not been addressed by the major powers. Right? That's what the Bandung Conference is going to do, and these countries are going to stake a position there. Right? And I would say, incidentally, that even though officially India, there is no such thing as non-alignment anymore, and not simply because the Cold War ended at some point with the fall of the Berlin Wall, because what you have effectively is obviously a much more unilateral world rather than a multipolar world after the fall of the Berlin Wall, at least for those 2 decades following 1990. I would say that India's position has tacitly continued to be one of non-alignment, even though, as I said, there's no Cold War now, and there's no official doctrine of non-alignment. So, for example, India maintains friendly relations with Russia today. Okay, it maintains friendly relations with Russia. It's also trying to forge a special relationship with the United States. There's much more contact now between the administration, whichever administration it might be, whether the Bush administration in the past or the Obama administration in the present, and the administration in India, right? The attempt is to not necessarily find a middle path, but to not commit oneself to the ideological formations of either the United States or of Russia. Okay, and again, you have to remember that we're not speaking about the same thing, because Russia is no longer committed to communism as such. Right? So the context obviously has changed considerably since the fall of the Berlin Wall. All right, third point there, Indo-Pakistan War. So I've spoken about this. Differences with the U.S., because the U.S., as I said, came down on the side of Pakistan, decided to support Pakistan in this. In fact, the hostility towards India was enormous in the Nixon administration. And if you read the Blood Telegram book, it's extraordinary, because what this book does is it gives you the transcripts of conversations that took place between Nixon and his Secretary of State. I hope you remember who his Secretary of State was. Kissinger, who's still very much alive, right? Senior statesman and all of that. And Kissinger, frankly, I mean, 4 or 5 letter abuse words for Indira Gandhi are generously to be found in these transcripts. Very generous use. I mean, he basically detested Indira Gandhi, right? And is very clear about that. And in fact, there are portions of this transcript where Nixon more or less takes the view, hey, these Muslims killing other Muslims, what the hell do we have to do with it? It's great, let it happen. He more or less takes explicitly that view. Nixon in 1971. And of course, my view is that's exactly the reason why many of the conflicts in the Muslim world are allowed to be perpetrated, because the view in the West, although no one will say it openly, is, well, these people are just killing each other. That just leads to a reduction of Muslims in the world. It's fantastic for us. There are people who are actually thinking that, and this is why that book really is an eye-opener, because it shows you the transcripts of the discussions between Nixon and Kissinger. Let the genocide take place, effectively, is what the administration is really saying. Okay? We don't really care. You know, Hindus, Muslims, especially Muslims versus Muslims, you know, they're all the same. Okay? So, you know, you have to keep this in mind in order to understand something like non-alignment, because there was deep suspicion in India towards all foreign powers, whether it be the United States or whether it be the Soviet Union, right? Partly because of the past. And then finally, to sum it up, what are we talking about when we look at India today? So India becomes a nuclear power. In 1997, they had actually first gone nuclear, when this term is almost an oxymoron, but you know, in the early 1970s, India explodes what they called a peaceful nuclear device, PND. Peaceful nuclear device. I don't know what a peaceful nuclear device is, frankly, but what they meant was that they basically had the capacity to develop an atomic bomb, but they were not going to do it because they were going to use nuclear energy for other purposes, for peaceful purposes, right? So when India, by the way, decided to you know, become a nuclear state, but not fully so, and this is in the early 1970s, the response of Bhutto, and Bhutto is, you saw a photograph of Bhutto. Bhutto is a prime minister of Pakistan. So the response of Bhutto was, I am prepared to let the people of Pakistan eat grass if they have to, but Pakistan is going to match India. We're going to divert our resources and we're going to come up with a nuclear bomb. Right? That's his response. I'm prepared to let my people eat grass, he says. Okay, so what of course, and this was one of the concerns, was that, you know, are you going to have a nuclear arms race now in South Asia? And effectively you did. And then finally, of course, in 1997, when a Hindu nationalist party comes into power in India and constitutes a government, India decides to become an open nuclear state. So, you know, there's a series of nuclear explosions that they carry out, nuclear tests that they carry out, and Pakistan is going to respond within 2 to 3 weeks. Right? So what you have in South Asia is you've got two nuclear powers, both of which have appalling series of problems having to do with food, distribution of resources, access to education. Right? These are countries that have failed miserably, both of them, in meeting the needs of their subjects, but they're both nonetheless nuclear states. And then finally, to wrap up this discussion, the attempts of India to be considered something like an emerging power. And of course, this is something that is going to be more so the case after 1990. Why 1990? Because that's when the neoliberalization policies, right, start to come into effect. India decided it's going to open itself up to the world economy, it's going to integrate more into the world economy, it's going to remove some of the restrictions that have made it difficult for foreign corporations to do business in India. It's going to introduce a more business-friendly climate, right, as it's known. So post-1990, you have these neoliberalization reforms, and India will now experience a substantially increased rate of growth. And that is when Indian leaders begin to imagine, and frankly, that's the only word, because I don't think India is far from being any kind of power, but nonetheless, they're going to begin to imagine that India should now be viewed as, certainly as, if not a world power, as an emerging power, and therefore this might mean certain amount of renegotiation of its relations with different countries, such as the US, Russia, China, and Japan. So, for example, at the moment, you know, its relations with China and Japan, again, are an interesting part of the story if you were looking at contemporary policy, because China is a very substantial trading partner for India. China is, of course, a substantial trading partner for most countries of the world now, right, including the United States. But it's the increase in you know, trade between India and China has been dramatic. On the other hand, China is a hostile power. It's a hostile power. It's a neighboring power. Right? It has aspirations from the point of view of India to portions of Indian territory, contested Indian territory. So to offset that, what India has attempted to do is to forge much closer links with Japan. Okay? So this is, again, a very short discussion of the geopolitics of being India from 1947 to the present. All right, now any questions, because this basically wraps up my discussion of this whole section on politics, and I want to just take a few minutes to set up my discussion of the next section. I'll take one more question. Yeah.
What was the international response to the arms race in South Asia? What India and
Oh, they condemned it. And the U.S. condemned it. Yeah, because there's also a nuclear non-proliferation treaty, right? I'm sure that many of you are familiar with it. So India and Pakistan are two countries that are not signatories to the treaty. Israel is not a signatory to that treaty, right? Yeah. So essentially, the U.S. And of course, there were Indian nationalists who were saying, "Well, the U.S. has got no business telling us what to do, because if the U.S. is a nuclear power, it certainly cannot be lecturing to any other country about whether they should be a nuclear power or not." But that was a view of obviously Indian nationalists. But the answer to your question is yes, there was nearly universal condemnation. I think that in some parts of the third world they were actually rather pleased, because it showed that a developing country could now become a nuclear state, right? So if you did a much more lengthy exploration, I think you're going to find that there were countries where they looked at it rather differently. But overall, condemnation, criticism of India and Pakistan for becoming open nuclear states. I mean, it was an open secret that both of them had the ability to be nuclear states. But that's why they use the phrase open secret. That you know it, and yet you want to pretend that it's not there. And so now what India did was it removed the ambiguity. It said, we're just going to let everybody know openly that we are a nuclear state. Yeah. Okay. I just want to move on to the next section very briefly. I want to talk about communal conflict. Okay. Because what is this section we're talking about? Now, we've talked about it already to some degree. We talked about it, for example, when I looked at Sri Lanka briefly, the conflict in Sri Lanka. Okay. But I want to look at this, what is called communal conflict. And the word communal here does not mean what it means to most people in the English language, insofar as I've ever heard of it. So, for example, many people think it's related to communes, living in a commune. It doesn't have anything to do with living in a commune. Right? It doesn't have to do with, a cooperative society, anything of that kind. If you had to translate it into another phrase, for the sake of convenience, and in my next lecture, I'm going to describe to you what the difference is between religious conflict and communal conflict. Okay? But if you had to translate it into another phrase, for the sake of convenience, think of it as religious conflict. Okay? And when we say religious conflict, we're talking about conflict between, for example, Hindus and Muslims, or between Muslims and Sikhs, or between Sikhs and Hindus, or Christians and Hindus. Right? 4 different scenarios that we can think about. Whether it should be used to describe conflict within a faith, for example, between the Shias and the Sunnis, is an interesting question, because some of the disputes in Pakistan, for example, one of the sources of conflict is between the Shias and the Sunnis. One of the sources of conflict is between the Ahmadiyas, okay, which is a community that is not recognized in the state of Pakistan as a Muslim community, although they all claim to be Muslims. Right? So the Ahmadiyas are officially not even recognized in Pakistan. They are recognized in India, because you have an Ahmadiyya community in India as well. But should this be referred to as a communal conflict or not? That's a question that we need not be really detained by. For example, Shia-Sunni conflict. What I want you to understand is the broader contours of religious conflict. But before we do that, we have to talk about something called identity. Okay? So that's what I want to do, is I want to set it up for you. So my question to you would be, let me see if I can get a few answers, and then what is identity? Right? I mean, you've all heard of it, and you know that the American university campus, UCLA being a very good illustration of that, has been a campus where identity politics has been crucial since the 1960s. Since the late 1960s, early 1970s, there's been something called identity politics. And so identity politics means in part that, for example, African Americans or Chicano Americans whatever community you want to take, they might say that, well, we think of ourselves as not just Americans, but we think of ourselves as Chicano Americans, and therefore we want a course of study that is more commensurate with our needs. Right? So if you study the history of how departments came up, when did a Chicano studies? One of the largest demonstrations that ever took place on this campus in the history of this university, which is almost 100 years old. Okay, UCLA will celebrate its centenary in 2019. One of the largest demonstrations that ever took place on this campus was when Chicano students and Chicana students decided that they were going to agitate for a department of Chicana studies, which eventually was created. Okay, so I think all of you understand that's what is in America is called identity politics. But before we get to identity politics, we have to get to identity. So what is identity? Yes, Dominic.
How you view yourself and how you want any community you're a part of.
So what would be the bedrock, what would be the bread and butter of identity, would you say? What's the bedrock of identity? Not to turn personal, but let's supposing that somebody asked you, or somebody asked me, who are you? Right? So what would you say?
Yeah, I don't know.
You don't know. So I thought you just told me identity is who you are, so you don't know who you are. You must know who you are. I hope so, at least to some degree. So you're a guy. So can we just translate that into a little more official academic language? So a guy, what's the term for that? Huh? Gender. Okay. So one element of identity is gender. And what's the other element of what might be some of the other elements of identity? Huh? Sorry? Okay. And what else? Ethnicity. Okay. And anything else? Religion, culture. Okay. So here we go. We've got enough now. Okay. Religion. So for example, let's supposing that somebody asked me, I'll take my example. I don't have any problems talking about my example here because I can complicate it very easily. Okay. So somebody said, well, who are you? So my first response might be tacitly to myself to say that, well, it depends on who's asking and in what context. Let me give you a very simple illustration. If I'm in India, where everybody's an Indian, almost everybody, 99.999% people are Indians there. If anybody said to me, who are you? And I said, I'm an Indian, that would be an awfully stupid answer to give. Okay? It would be awfully stupid answer to give. Because of course I'm an Indian. So what would I be expected to say? I might be expected to say I'm a Punjabi, or a Bengali, or a Gujarati, or a Tamilian. Right? That would make more sense because when somebody says, who are you, or where are you from, usually in America, they go, where are you from? Right? You meet somebody, well, where are you from? So if in India somebody said to me, where are you from? They obviously don't mean to say, are you from India or not? They mean to say, which part of India are you from? Whereas, on the other hand, if somebody in America asked me, where are you from, or who are you, and I said I'm a Gujarati, there'll be a blank look on their face. Gujarati, like what is that? Is that another name for apple pie, or another name for language, or what is a Gujarati? So obviously, what would I say? I would say Indian. Correct? Okay? Now you see, we're saying that the supposition of who you are, we haven't even started yet. We're going to have to spend a lot of time trying to figure this out, because without this, we cannot understand the whole nature of the problem. Okay? I want you to just start thinking along these lines, and I'm going to open this question up a lot more in my next lecture. Let me remind you, no class on Tuesday. It's a holiday, as we're going to meet on Thursday. Okay?